Welcome to the MEND, a podcast to learn about services and support for victims and survivors of crime, sponsored by the Center for Crime Victim Services of Vermont. I'm Anna Nasset, and I am your host of this bi-monthly podcast and show. And today I am delighted to have Kendra Malone here to talk about IDEA, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Institute. Welcome, Kendra.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yes. This show was created to take a deeper look at services, organizations, and concepts for victims and survivors of crime. We want to acknowledge our healing process and provide resources not only in our state of Vermont, but throughout the country that could benefit victims of crime as they begin to mend. I want to always begin with a content warning. Our goal is to create a safe place to discuss topics of healing, but within that, we may occasionally hear a story related to a crime, discuss our mental health, or have other sensitive matter. We urge you to care for yourself and listen at your own discretion. So as I said, today I have Kendra Malone here. Kendra has been addressing issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice for over 20 years as a trainer, consultant, facilitator, educator, artist, speaker, and activist. They have a breadth of experience developing and facilitating educational and connection building encounters founded in strengthening cultural humility among diverse audiences, with a focus of the liberation of communities of color, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities, anti-violence, and community empowerment. Thank you so much for sharing space with us today.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. I look forward to our conversation.
Me too. I'm excited to learn about your work and what you're doing here in our state of Vermont. Kendra has been working with the Center for Crime Victim Services on programming, and they will be sharing with us about that. But as we begin, I'd love to hear just kind of a short overview of what you're comfortable sharing with how you were called into this work.
Sure. So I think it's important when we talk about equity work and liberation work, which is the framework that I enter this work, that we have the ability to situate ourselves. So in response to that question, I think it's important for me to share that, I've been recently dealing with some health issues. And so that has made living sometimes challenging. And I share that because I think it's important for us to be able to show up as who we are, right, in doing the work of liberation, which I would include anti-violence work specifically in that. And so, I think being able to name kind of where we're at and what's going on for us as we have these conversations, as we organize, as we really take up the work of, equity, that we're able to position ourselves. So I certainly appreciate your caveat at the beginning, inviting folks to be thoughtful about what might be shared here. And so really being able to move through the world as my full self. I am a survivor of various forms of violence. I am a queer person of color, and those realities have created specific types of challenges for me to be able to live and work and love and contribute to the world in ways that I find meaningful. And so I have been fortunate to make a career as well as a lifestyle of equity work. And so the experiences that I had brought me to this work. And I think that's a story and an experience that many folks who find themselves in any kind of social justice work, victim services work, anything, in those respective fields can relate to. And that's certainly what has brought me here. What has asked me to stay is that I'm good at it. I took some lived experience and built community around that. And from there, learned that I had some skill set, both in terms of professional skill set, but emotional and spiritual skill set that allows me to do this work, because this work is not easy. There is joy in it, but there's also a lot of pain and trauma and having to contend with the realities of the oppressive cultural systems that we find ourselves in. And so being able to have that be an invitation to do some personal work and some collective work in community is kind of where I find myself today.
Amazing. I love that you just said, and I'm good at it. I love that, because we don't remember to do that too often, right?
I am
and
good
I really,
at what I do.
Yeah, it's hard to remember to do that, especially in this work where we're giving and giving and giving. It's like, yeah, we are good at this. So thank you for that. And I also really appreciated you, being transparent with how you're showing up here today. I think that so often in these fields that we walk in, we're supposed to show up because completely energized and ready to go, and like nothing else is happening. We've checked everything at the door, but the reality is life is happening. And that's something I've been trying to do more of within my own work, is acknowledging where I'm at as I'm coming into a space and sharing or teaching. So thank you for that. And
You're welcome.
and
Yeah,
thank you for and thank you for turning your experiences into this work.
yeah, I think one of the principles that has been instrumental in my healing journey is the principle of duality, right? That multiple things can be true at the same time. And that has been really freeing and opening up my ability to move through and be in the nuances of life. So yes, to be quite honest, I don't feel good today. And I still have the ability, through the work that I've done, through the loving community that I'm going to connect with after this, to get, some support that I need around the emotional energy that I've expended during our conversation. Both of those things can be true. I can not feel well, I can plan to rest this afternoon, and I can still show up and have this important conversation with you because it matters to me. And so, being able to be in that duality has been very liberating for me.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to be taking note of that for myself as well. Thank you. It's an important lesson to remind us all of. So in the interest of you not feeling well, I want to be mindful of your time today.
Sure, of course.
Can you share with us about the IDEA Institute and your work with the Center for Crime Victim Services here in Vermont?
Sure. Yeah. So Jean from CCVS and I connected in November to start a conversation about what does it look like for victim service providers in the state of Vermont to deepen their equity work. And of course, just as a side note, when we talk about, IDEA work, there's so many acronyms, right, that exist. So, for the purposes of this, we're talking about inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. A lot of people talk about, DEI. A lot of people talk about JEDI, so I think it's important to just recognize that really at the end of the day, what we're talking about is anti-oppression and liberation work, right? That's the genesis of this work. That's why it's necessary, right? Is because we have a very real history and contemporary reality of systems of oppression that impact particular communities of people, right? And so we can call it whatever we want, but really, let's be clear that we're talking about the fact that oppression is alive and well in this country. It has a very deep history of harm. And so really what we're trying to do is equip victim service providers to continue to provide services to victims, right? And we know that the violence that folks have experienced who are victims comes from the fact that oppression exists, right? And so, being able to see that holistic picture is really important. And so I just want to make sure that we're very clear on that. And so Jean and I had this conversation about what does it look like to support victim service providers in deepening that work, because so many of the providers in Vermont have been doing this work for a very long time. There are others who are kind of newer to doing this work intentionally. And so I think we, decided that it would be helpful to be able to provide an opportunity, one, for service providers to kind of take a look at and celebrate how, they have accomplished the ability to be more thoughtful, right, about equity work, about liberation work, about, serving communities that we know have been very intentionally left at the wayside when it comes to service provision, while also helping folks craft a clear vision on what they can do realistically to deepen that work in ways that are meaningful for them. And so that conversation turned into a collaborative to host a 3-day equity institute, the IDEA Institute, that was held in person in Vermont. It was a hybrid model where I was able to join you all in your beautiful state for a couple of days in January, and really have some conversations with folks and, get an idea of what this work means to people. Because really the heart of equity work, the heart of liberation work is collaboration, right? And co-creation, and being able to simultaneously honor the important work that's already been done, but also to be able to peel away at the layers of how our institutions, right, victim service providers included, are still harmful institutions that are operating in, white supremacy, heterosexist norms, kind of all of the ways that those things are embedded, right, in kind of everything that we do. And so that looked like a 3-day institute. Myself and some collaborators of mine created an IDEA strategic planning guide. And what that guide does is lays out the foundations of anti-oppression work. It looks at, really important but sometimes challenging examples of this work in victim service provider fields, and really is a step-by-step guide that folks can follow along to begin to deepen and think about and create action around what does it mean to institutionalize this work, right? I think a lot of times when we see this work happening, not just in victim services, but in any kind of nonprofit business, government affiliated office, people have good intentions, but the strategy isn't there, the action isn't there to actually bring it to fruition. And so really this institute was an opportunity to support folks in asking the hard questions, taking a look at themselves as individuals, right, and being able to name the privileges that they carry, the ways that they might be impacted by oppression, and how that saturates, right, the systems that they work in, all with an eye towards what does that then mean to create strategies and conversations with the communities that we know need our care and support that might not necessarily be able to access us. So that's where we started. So we did the institute, and now over the next few months, we're going to be doing several virtual check-ins where folks can check in, talk about their progress. I can offer support, bounce ideas, and that will all come to a culmination in June, where folks will have an opportunity to present kind of their progress in creating the plan to their peers for feedback, for support, and just to be able to continue to build community around our efforts to continue to deepen our practices, couched in liberation and equity.
Incredible. I've had a chance to look through the report or the guide that you created and was really just blown away by the work that's happening here. And because it is so necessary. It's, we're all here trying to care for people, but we have to acknowledge the oppression that we carry and be able to really look deep into that, to be able to shift. It's like, I really appreciate what you said. So often we're all talk. We have these good intentions, good ideas, but there isn't that follow through and there isn't that depth. And so I'm really excited by this institute and the depth that you're bringing to it and the follow through to really not just be talk, but actually implement and continue to evolve this field into what it needs to be. So that's incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think it's important to, remember that this work is a long game, right? And so how do we find ways to sustain it, right? I think what we've seen, in the last 5-10 years around equity work kind of more broadly in the United States is kind of one and done, flashy, things. And I think that there, is a small place for that, but what can folks really do and also be mindful of capacity, right? Like one of the things that I hear, particularly from nonprofits who are in, the social services field, victim services, anything really having to do with social impact work are already spread so thin. So one of the key components of both the Institute, but the ongoing conversation, the ongoing support is what can you do realistically? And what does it look like to make this a priority? And when we have to make something a priority, that means we have to set other things down.
Yep.
Right. And for those of us who are passionate, right, about our fields, about our work, about supporting people, setting something down feels often opposite of what is the right thing to do, right? And so we have to be really thoughtful about what can we realistically do as individuals, as institutions, in terms of personnel time, in terms of emotional capacity, in terms of financial resources. And so I think dreaming big, yes, but how do we also think about and move forward in a way that's sustainable for the individuals, executing the work, as well as the organizations that are, housing, services and initiatives to support, survivors of violence.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, classic example is I was late to our podcast today because I had written down the time wrong, people. And why is that? Because I had too many things juggling. I hadn't put something down. And it's such an important thing to remember that, like, yeah, to bring in and to prioritize, we have to reshift our other things, and that this is work that has to be prioritized. And, I want to echo what you said. This is the long game. I often say, like, we are doing work that we may not see the results of, but hopefully our children, our grandchildren see the results of. Like, this is very long work that isn't the one and done. It's not the flashy thing. It's that continuous head down, feet forward work that people do in this field to slowly over time continue to create that change.
Absolutely. And I think in addition to that, though, liberation happens in relationship. And so, yes, absolutely long game. And when you're able to have a meaningful conversation, with a colleague or with, somebody who's come to seek support around, experiencing violence, or, with a group of people in your community, and people in that conversation feel seen, validated, like they matter, that's also important too. And so I think being able to hold, here's that principle of duality again, right? Being able to hold the large system change, organizational change, while also holding that the relationships that happen, the conversations that happen, the connections built between people is also important, right? And so being able to simultaneously have an eye on both of those things is really important. And I know for me, when I started doing this work, I had my
Yes,
eyes
absolutely.
set
I mean,
on.
go ahead.
No, you cut out and jumped. So
that's okay. I was going to say that, I find so much of, like, the biggest change happens in those quiet conversations.
Yes,
Of making that space and going, okay, I've got the big picture over here. I've got all these things I need to do, but I'm going to put all of that aside to have that conversation, because that's the ripple effect. And I always talk about things as in, like, it's the ripple, like we're the pebble, and we want to just keep being that pebble and spreading that ripple out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So lots of layers, right? Lots of beautiful, infuriating layers, to this work, of equity and liberation, and really for me of love, right? Loving other people, and deeply caring for them.
Love that. Yeah, if we don't have love, and I mean, sometimes that's the hardest part, is to have love for the people who are causing harm, who need that redirection, who need to have those conversations, is so challenging. And, there are times where I think, why is it my responsibility to have those conversations and to hold that love? But without love, we don't see change.
Right. And I think one of the, approaches that is really, important to me in the work that I do, and that I invite, those who decide to come along, is the somatic work, the body work. So, let's take, for example, white privilege, right? When folks who are racialized as white in this country are confronted with their white privilege and how it has impact on themselves, their work, the communities that they're a part of, that's a very painful thing to have to contend with, right? And so one of the things that is really important in doing this work is starting from a place of deepening our ability to be in our bodies with the pain of the ways that privilege harms other people. Because for many people, when we know that we've caused harm unintentionally or otherwise, that's a painful thing for us to contend with. We need to be able to take responsibility for it. We need to be able to, work to change it. And so that's really where I start when we talk about, those in this American cultural system who have a lot of social privileges, is to be able to honor folks' humanity, right? And saying that, like, when you have to contend with particularly white privilege, that is a painful thing to do. And so what are the things that you can get support around to be able to be in your body so that when those defense mechanisms come up, when you find yourself in a situation where you have to take accountability for something, how can you move in and through that in a way that it's in alignment with your values, but that is not hindered by that reality? And so, that's where we start, is being able to be in our bodies, because the primary barriers to doing this work is the somatic response we have to when we are being held accountable, or when we're being asked to be open to correction, or when we have to look at the very real history and contemporary realities of oppression. That is painful stuff, and that lives in our bodies, right? And so that is another really, I think, crucial component that for folks listening who are in this work or interested in learning more, is how are you taking care of your body in ways that allow you to be with the realities of oppression.
Yes. What are some kind of tools that you bring to your trainings around how to have those somatic practices for people who don't understand what somatic practices are?
Sure, yeah.
Maybe a little bit helpful, and just kind of some of the practices that you bring in.
Absolutely. So I know for me and for many people in my community, meditative practices have been really crucial in being able to actually be present in our bodies. Those of us who are survivors of violence and who are survivors of oppressive systems, which are also a form of violence, are often disconnected from our bodies. And that's understandable. And I know a lot of therapeutic healing modalities for survivors of trauma include body work, or somatic work is another way to talk about it. And so we apply those principles to liberation work and equity work for all involved. And so that looks like meditative practices where we learn to be still, right, with ourselves. I think to refer back to your comment earlier about kind of being spread thin, right? Like, we are such a grind and hustle culture that's very normalized and actually championed. We find it very sexy to be so busy, that we as a culture have really lost the ability to be present in our bodies and with other people. And for me, that's where it starts. So, meditation practices, breathing practices, all with foundations, in Buddhism, right? Looking at indigenous and other kind of worldly spiritual practices, like whatever your spiritual or faith practice might be. And for folks who are atheists or don't have one, that might be a connection with larger humanity, and really getting at the root of how we connect with our bodies and with each other. And so meditation, stillness, just intentional body check-in. I also regularly invite people who are doing kind of any type of social impact work, is what is your strategy for wellness, right? So that could often look like therapy, that could look like a faith community, that could look like me, I'm a budding witch, right? And so really having those things in place to be able to continue to move forward, I think, are really important. So even if it's just taking time to stop and reflect on what do you have in place for your whole wellness, right? Before entering these spaces, or for folks who have been doing this kind of work for a long time, pausing to reflect on, is the way that you're entering this work sustainable for you? And a realization that I had several years ago is how I was approaching this work was not sustainable for me. And so I had to get very, very serious and very real with myself of how can I actually enter the work of my heart in a way that doesn't actually damage me. So I think self-awareness and understanding what matters to you, what has value and meaning for you, and how can you connect with that in ways that allow you to be in your body and move in that direction. And I think for a lot of people, just the thought of trying to say, I'm going to intentionally be in my body is scary. It freaks people out, because as an American cultural system, we don't value that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so to try to ask people to do something that we don't see in mainstream ways as being valued, it can be challenging. I know for me, it was very challenging to do any type of work about intentionally being present in my body. Like it's still really hard sometimes, actually quite a bit. So,
Oh, I hear ya.
yeah.
Yeah, I just started seeing a new therapist who works in the somatic practices and modalities, and it has been very challenging for me because I'm the one that's like, let's keep going. We got to get in here. Like, I'm here to talk. Like, let's do this. And instead, those first 10 minutes are all about meditation or breathing or yoga. And it's really creating a great shift in me and allowing me to really kind of refocus some things like you're saying and saying, like, we cannot continue this work if we're not caring for oneself. It doesn't work. And I know I've been learning the lessons the hard way around that. And so thank you for sharing that. I think that's something that so many people will identify with, and that it's good to put those practices in place and to think outside of the box, even if it's uncomfortable for you. You might just lean into it. When I started out, I said to my therapist, I was like, I'm not into woo-woo. I can do like a woo, but I can't do a woo yet.
Can't do the full woo.
No, I think I'm into like the woo now. Maybe I'm adding an O, but it's like just, trying these different things out. It was really important. So we could probably talk for hours, but I'm kind of looking over the questions. We've answered some of them, but can you kind of explain the anti-oppression framework? I think that would probably be like the biggest question that I would like to focus on as we kind of wind this down today. Is just kind of looking at that for people who are listening.
Sure. So I think one of the most important things to remember when we're talking about liberation, right, which is doing the work of addressing oppression, is that there are so many ways to enter and to think about and to experience and to embody that like there is no one way, right? And I think it's important for folks who are listening, who are committed to this work, to really remember to listen to the communities that are most impacted wherever they may be, right? And to take lead from those folks. Because I think a lot of times, particularly with the professionalization, right, of victim services and a lot of, DEI work, IDEA, right, going back to like the acronyms, right, and how work that started, right, as grassroots activism, right, like we see the, violence against women movement, we see civil rights and racial justice, we see, trans rights movements, like all of our important cultural change started with people organizing, right, at a very local level. And so, and we've seen that kind of evolve culturally to be more professionalized, right? Which I think there's certainly benefit there, right? Because I operate in that sphere a lot. But, being able and willing to set down kind of one's own agenda, one's pride, one's kind of, I am expert, right? And really have conversations, right, with the people that are in your communities, and those that, you might understand have, experiences of marginalization. And so, the root, right, is understanding those experiences and prioritizing those. So, having said that, an anti-oppressive framework really looks at the co-creation of moving into places where, everyone is able to thrive and live and love and have access to the needs of daily living with limited barriers, right? And so, being able to, going back to what I said, earlier in our conversation, is, the heart of IDEA work, or, whatever we want to call it, is addressing oppression, which has very systematically, both intentionally and unintentionally, harmed in very real ways particular communities, right? People of color, queer folks, folks living with disabilities, immigrants, folks whose first language isn't English. All of these communities, have very real lived experiences of having this country and its systems and its organizations, dismissing and actively harming, right? And so being able to contend with that, right, as an individual, and going back to our conversation about somatic work, about the importance of relationship and interpersonal conversations, having those things be the core of how we then look at institutions and work to change those things. So ranging from thinking about an office's culture, right, to looking at policies of an organization, to looking at more large macro United States legislation. Like there's all of these places that we can see how can we plug in to identify harm that has been caused, that's still being caused, and change it.
Amazing. I mean, I think it's incredible work. And I think one of the biggest things I just heard was like that we need to listen.
Absolutely.
Like there's just way too much of that savior complex of like, oh, you're in my office, I'm going to save you, I'm going to take this on, I'm going to make choices for you, I'm going to be your voice. And that is a very harmful approach. Especially when working with victims of crime. It's a very harmful approach because it's continuing that power and control dynamic. And for victims and survivors to show up into your office and to go through this process towards whatever justice looks like for them, they have to be the lead. They like, that is just something I speak about a lot, is just like, you have to let us have our voice, because if we find our voice, we're going to start to find courage. And so being there as that listening and guide is so imperative.
Absolutely. Well, also, I think as those who are providing services also have, deep awareness around their social locations, right? And the identities that they carry, and how that may be a place of connection or a place of hindrance, right? For those that the organizations that are providing victim services adhere to, while also remembering that communities aren't static, and so the ability to be agile, right, and being responsive to what communities may need when it comes to healing around violence, right? And so that looks very different for a lot of people. And so I think one of the primary roles I see, particularly victim services providers, is to be kind of the bulldozer that knocks down barriers, right? To act as a guide to navigate very convoluted bureaucratic systems that are maddening to all of us.
Absolutely.
So, I think that's a very crucial role. And to highlight your point again, the listening, right? Active listening, I think, is one of the most powerful things we can do for folks who've experienced violence and trauma. Is one of the most healing things we can do, is just to bear witness, right, to another human's experience. And so I think as an extension of that, like, we don't necessarily always have to do something about it, right? And so being able to just start with listening and with conversations, and with taking the guidance from either the individual who is seeking a service, or from communities that you're building relationship with, is being able to take guidance, right? I think is one of the key pieces to equity work, is being able to receive information, experiences that inform how you move forward, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that so often we approach each conversation or each person we work with, or whatever it might be, with, we're going to teach them, we're going to educate them, instead of flipping and saying to every single person I meet or interact with, thinking, what can I learn from them, is a shift that I think we need to take, not only in this work, but in our daily practice of life as well. Just with whoever we come into contact with, we get so in that thing of like the sound of our own voice versus that listening and learning, because that's really where the change happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you give us trying to look at my questions here. So I kind of have an idea of how this is being implemented here in our state. Can you share some examples of effectiveness you've seen in implementing and having this institute in other places that you've worked outside of Vermont?
Sure. So, some, effective practices that I've seen, I'll take an approach from kind of more of an organizational level, is, doing really intentional community building and collaboration, so being thoughtful about, who's informing, program delivery and design, evaluation, who's sitting on your board. So I've seen a lot of really important work with advisory councils, right? Where folks are intentionally inviting people who, have not necessarily been considered a priority, right? To inform, right? How organizations are run, program delivery. I've seen some really effective models in terms of acting as incubators, right, for maybe smaller culturally specific organizations who have maybe one or two or three people who are doing important anti-violence work in their respective communities, but because of the realities of how, our infrastructures are set up, don't necessarily have the access to the resources or the capacity to kind of deepen their ability to do work. And so I've seen a lot of really great, incubation of culturally specific organizations. I think I've also seen some really important work done within organizations around racial privilege and folks who are white, how, whatever that might mean to someone, doing the work together in community with other white people to unpack that pain that we talked about earlier, but also to strategize what meaningful accountability looks like, right? So I think a lot of times we see, across kind of fields, affinity spaces, right, for particular communities to have space, with folks they share community with, and I think that those are really important. But I think oftentimes when we're talking about affinity spaces for folks who are subjected to marginalization, there's then also the expectation that they'll be the only ones that do the work around, racism, around, queer inclusion, and so on. But really, at the end of the day, those who hold the privilege and cause the harm are the ones that need to stop causing the harm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so for, folks who to go back to talking about, white supremacy and racial privilege, I've seen a lot of really great affinity spaces around white racialization and folks really taking the lead on, anti-racism work in, conjunction with other systems of oppression to change themselves, right, and their organizations in some really meaningful ways. So I've seen some good work there. And I've seen, if we're thinking more kind of also macro, putting your money, right, where your mouth is. And so putting, what is significant, for your organization, financial resources, both into this work as an organization, as an institution, but also funneling it to the communities that need it the most, right? And so, as an American capitalist place, money talks. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's not necessarily the end all be all. There's a lot of other important work, but, we have to be realistic as well. And so seeing places put significant and intentional financial resources to supporting, particular communities or supporting, the work of, investigating, right, the ways that oppressive systems operate in their organizations has also been important. So I think those are some of the ways that I've seen, folks kind of move in the direction of increased equity for the purpose of liberation. And also, just going back to the conversation we had earlier, asking for guidance, right? Asking for guidance
Mm-hmm.
from the communities most impacted by these realities and saying, what can we do as an organization to better serve you? And sometimes, I've seen organizations completely dissolve, right? And, kick their budgets over to other organizations so that they can flourish, So I think it really is contextual, right? And depends on the needs of your community, the needs of your organization, and any, other how do I want to, like, bureaucratic realities, right? Because like we also operate in a bureaucratic place. And so what is realistically approachable to you? And what does that look like?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a thing of don't do what makes you comfortable because we cause the pain. So, we need to be looking inward, but so not doing what's comfortable, but looking and seeing what is necessary. What is the work that is necessary in your actual community and being creative around that? Because, we're in a very rural population here in Vermont with pockets of cities, but they're very small cities, right? But so it's a very rural area. And it's like, how do you start to be creative for your own community? And if you're in an extremely rural area, and then maybe it is you're donating, you're giving your money, you're saying, okay, like I'm not sure how to do this right here, but I know that I can donate. I can take my donation from over here and put it over there, or I got a bonus, I'm going to put it into these organizations over here, and just being really creative and intentional around this work.
Absolutely. And another example, that I can pull, from Vermont specifically, and the work, that I'm doing with you all, there is the narrative that I kept hearing from lots of folks that I was interacting with, is that Vermont is so white, we can't find people of color to do XYZ. So that could be either work here, be on our board, provide services to. And something that I invited folks to think about is, one, with that narrative, Vermont so white, you are completely erasing, right, the people of color that do live there.
Yep.
Right, regardless of how small the percentage is. And really, what does a perspective shift look like that, given the realities of the racial demographics of the state of Vermont, then it becomes the responsibility of anyone who's working in victim services, regardless of racial experience, to become more versed in serving the communities that you have there, right? And I think another hidden layer under that sentiment is this expectation that if you hire more people of color, or whatever your targeted community might be, that then it becomes their responsibility to serve those people, right? So like hidden, like in layers under that sentiment was like a lot of garbage, right? That I heard from a lot of folks in Vermont, and so it's like, well, let's unpack what you're really trying to say, right? Which is an erasure of a community that absolutely is here. And that community is responsible for its own care wholly, right? And so it's like, how do we, and one of the kind of pieces of pushback I get from folks is, how do you expect me to be versed in kind of all communities? And that's not the ask, right? Like, let's be very clear what the ask is. The ask is, doing work around self-awareness, having an understanding of how your identities and the communities that you belong to do or don't have privilege, and what that means, right, for your life. And being able to have thoughtful, but often messy conversations with a variety of people, and that you're open to correction, right? And that you have a willingness to try to provide support services, whatever your lane may be, in ways that are meaningful to the people that we know have these experiences, right? Even if that doesn't make sense to you. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, I think that's an important reminder, is to be thoughtful about what our expectations are about who is doing what.
Yep.
And what is our responsibility, particularly for folks who have a lot of privilege in an American cultural context, right? Like it is your responsibility to shift that power dynamic.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, thank you. And thank you really for like honing in on Vermont, because that is a sentiment we hear all too often. And it erases all the people that live here that are not white. And it's like, so thank you really for coming in and helping this state and showing them and guide them on how to start to really not only address, but take action.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been my pleasure. There are a lot of really committed both individuals but organizations in Vermont, which is really exciting. Like, it's exciting to see how committed folks are, both in terms of victim services, but as I was preparing to do this work with you all, I did my homework and poked around on who's doing what in Vermont. And so there's a lot of really important work happening in Vermont. And so I think, you all are primed, right, to kind of move to the next level.
Yes, absolutely. We're small, but we're mighty.
It's true.
Yeah, we're a really good incubator state of trying different things and taking
Right.
different approaches. And it's something that I've really appreciated since I've moved here, just the risks and the thoughts and the conversation and the creativity and the actions that come out of this little piece of land.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a willingness, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's another core piece of the work of liberation is being willing,
Yeah.
right? To like do whatever, like whatever the thing is, that there's a willingness to sit in conversation, to sit in discomfort, but also to do that in the name of love, right? And connection and humanity and valuing people, right? And supporting each other in accessing, my words are leaving me, in
That's okay.
uh accessing lives that have meaning to them, that help people get out of kind of survival mode. That is the consequence, right, of oppression.
Yes, absolutely. Do you have any good source of where people who are listening can go to get involved in the work happening here in our state or even a national
Yes, I do have a
level?
couple of suggestions. So you already mentioned the Center for Victim Services, which host this podcast. I think that they're a really great resource for folks. They're the ones that kind of spearheaded this work by inviting me in and having conversations and actually holding victim services providers accountable. Like it is now, the work that I did with the respective organizations, like it's a requirement now, like to get funding, that you have this IDEA strategy in place, so that you can be accountable to the fact that this work is a high priority, right? So I think connecting there. The Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence has a long history of doing anti-oppression work broadly, but around race specifically. So they would be a really great organization to connect with for folks who are specifically interested in victim services, for folks who are interested in kind of broad racial justice issues. The Vermont Racial Justice Alliance is doing some good work. So these would be folks, I think, sign up for a newsletter and kind of stay connected and see what they've got going on. In terms of national, holy cow, like there are so many people doing so many great things. But some of kind of the ones I look to more regularly is Race Forward. They're a national organization that builds bridge between advocacy and grassroots work and kind of more legislative national work, because like the work needs to happen everywhere. They're great. And then a organization that I've called upon many times over the years, and I actually called upon specifically for the IDEA strategic planning guide that I created for Vermont. They're called AORTA, AORTA. It stands for Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance. They do amazing work around equity education and strategic planning, and they've got a lot of really great resources on their website that specifically talk about the core concepts and experiences of anti-oppression. So I would highly encourage folks to check those places out. And then for folks who are interested in expanding their perspective on anti-violence work specifically, particularly for communities of color and Black folks specifically, there's a great book. It's called My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. It's by an author whose name is Resmaa Menakem, and it has been a very impactful book in my journey, and in validating the ways that racism and oppression are forms of violence, right? So I think when we talk about anti-violence work, we think about sexual violence and domestic violence and stalking, and those are important things to think about and to create movement around. But embedded in that, right, is other forms of oppression that impact particular communities differently. And so this book offers some insights around what particularly people of color who experience those forms of violence also have to contend with the very real violence, right? That is subjugation, discrimination, oppression. So those would be some places I would encourage folks to lean to.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I always like to give not only here in our state, but nationally as well, because we know we have listeners from all over, and to get involved wherever you are and look at what, your state's version of the Center for Crime Victim Service is doing, looking at what the agencies in your state are doing. And if they're not putting this into place, making those suggestions is a good thing as well. So, yeah. So thank you so much for being here today. I've really enjoyed this conversation immensely and learned a thing or two and gotten to listen, which is amazing. It's all we've, right here, we're listening, we're learning, we're having a conversation. That's what it's all about. I always like to close by asking my guests to give a message to victims and survivors who are listening today. So if you just have like a short little sentence or two that you would want to say to folks who are listening today that have experienced harm, especially oppression, I would welcome that.
Yeah, I would be happy to. So I think it's important for those of us who are survivors of violence to remember that we are enough, just as we are. We always have been, we always will be. And despite, our experiences and what the world might be telling us about our value and our worthiness, we are enough right now in this moment. And we are worthy of love and consideration and joy and laughter and play and rest, and having our needs met. We're worthy of those things. And so, what has been most impactful on my journey is really deepening my sense of self-love and worth. I think, a lot of us who have survived violence, struggle with that. And so, which is understandable, right? We have, science that tells us that why we struggle, and our spirits that tell us why we struggle. And so I invite you today to think of and make action around, what can I do to love myself today? Ask yourself that question. What can I do to show myself how much I care, and love and cherish myself? What is one thing I can do? Because I ask myself that every day.
That's a very good practice. That's a good practice for everyone. Thank you for that. And that's definitely something I'm going to do when I get off this podcast, is think about that, because it is very challenging for us to remember that we are enough just as we are. Yeah.
Wherever you're at, you're enough in this moment.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Kendra Malone, for being here today. It's been a joy speaking with you. I hope to meet you when you come back in June, and I hope you get some much needed rest the rest of the day. For those listening, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email is anna@standupresources.com. I'm your host, Anna, of this bi-weekly podcast and show called The MEND. Thank you so much for being with us. Be well, be strong, and goodbye. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review or feedback. We love hearing new topic ideas from listeners and watchers as well. Thank you for listening to The MEND, and be well.